Princess Catherine Eleanor Whitmore sat at the edge of her ornate bed, staring at the ivory invitation that had arrived that morning. The golden seal of the royal palace gleamed under the soft light filtering through her bedroom windows. Another formal dinner. Another evening where she would have to smile, nod, and follow the countless rules that governed her every move. At 23 years old, Catherine had attended more formal dinners than she could count. Each one was a carefully orchestrated performance where every gesture, every word, and every breath had to be perfect. But among all the rules that governed these events, there was one that stood above the rest. One rule that had been drilled into her since childhood. One rule that she was never, under any circumstances, permitted to break. She could never speak unless spoken to first by someone of equal or higher rank. The rule seemed simple enough to outsiders, but Catherine knew the weight it carried. In a room full of diplomats, foreign royalty, and government officials, this rule often meant she would sit in complete silence for hours. She had watched her younger brother, Prince Alexander, freely engage in conversations, laugh with guests, and share his opinions on various matters. But Catherine, as the elder child and heir to the throne, carried a different burden. Her governess, Lady Margaret Thornfield, had explained it to her when she was just 8 years old. "Your voice carries the authority of the crown, my dear. Every word you speak in public represents not just yourself, but the entire kingdom. You must choose your words wisely, and only when it is appropriate to do so." Catherine remembered nodding solemnly at the time, not fully understanding the isolation this rule would bring. As she grew older, she began to see how it shaped every social interaction she had. While other young women her age could freely express their thoughts and feelings, Catherine had to wait for permission to participate in conversations that often moved on to different topics before she had the chance to contribute. The upcoming dinner was particularly significant. It was being held to celebrate a new trade agreement between her kingdom and 3 neighboring nations. Representatives from each country would be present, along with various ministers and advisors. Catherine knew that the evening would be filled with important discussions about economics, agriculture, and diplomatic relations, topics she was passionate about and well-versed in thanks to years of private tutoring. Yet she also knew that unless someone specifically addressed her, she would spend the evening as a silent observer, watching conversations unfold around her, while her own insights remained locked away behind protocol. Catherine rose from her bed and walked to her writing desk, where she kept a private journal. It was one of the few places where she could express herself freely, without the constraints of royal protocol. She opened it to a fresh page and began to write. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to live in a world where my thoughts mattered as much as my title," she wrote, her pen flowing smoothly across the paper. "Today I received another dinner invitation, and already I can feel the familiar weight of silence settling upon me. I know so much about the trade negotiations they'll be discussing tonight. I've studied the economic reports, analyzed the potential benefits and challenges, and even developed some innovative ideas that could strengthen the partnerships. But unless someone asks for my opinion directly, all of this knowledge will remain hidden." She paused, looking out her window at the bustling courtyard below. Servants hurried about their duties, merchants delivered goods, and children played in the gardens. Each of them could speak freely, express their opinions, and engage with others without waiting for permission. Sometimes Catherine envied that freedom more than anything else. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, knocked softly on the door before entering. Sarah was only 2 years older than Catherine, but their different social positions meant their relationship was carefully defined by protocol. Still, over the years, Sarah had become one of the few people Catherine felt comfortable speaking with openly. "Your Highness," Sarah said with a small curtsy, "Lady Thornfield has sent word that she would like to review the evening's protocol with you before you begin preparing for dinner." Catherine sighed softly. More reminders about what she could and couldn't do, what she could and couldn't say. "Tell Lady Thornfield I'll meet her in the blue sitting room in 10 minutes. As Sarah left, Catherine returned to her journal one more time. I wonder if there will ever come a time when I can break this rule without bringing shame upon the crown. Sometimes I dream of standing up during one of these dinners and sharing my thoughts, my ideas, my dreams for our kingdom. But then I remember the weight of tradition, the expectations of our people, and the careful balance of diplomacy that my silence helps maintain. She closed the journal and prepared to meet with Lady Thornfield. As she walked through the corridors of the palace, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors, Catherine reflected on the contradiction of her position. She was being trained to one day rule a kingdom, to make decisions that would affect thousands of lives. Yet in social settings, she was often treated as decoration rather than a future leader. Lady Thornfield was waiting in the sitting room, her silver hair perfectly arranged and her back straight as a board. She had served the royal family for over 30 years and took her role as Catherine's governess very seriously. "Good afternoon, Your Highness," Lady Thornfield said, gesturing for Catherine to take a seat across from her. "I trust you've had time to review the guest list for this evening's dinner?" Catherine nodded. "Yes, Lady Thornfield. I've studied the backgrounds of all the attendees and familiarized myself with the current status of the trade negotiations." "Excellent. And you remember the seating arrangements?" "I'll be seated between Ambassador Richardson from the Eastern Kingdom and Minister Crawford from our own Treasury Department. Prince Alexander will be seated across from me, next to the delegate from the Northern Territories." Lady Thornfield smiled approvingly. "Very good. Now, let's review the proper protocol for this evening. You understand, of course, that as the heir to the throne, your conduct must be absolutely impeccable." Catherine had heard these words countless times before, but she listened patiently as Lady Thornfield recited the familiar litany of rules. How to hold her fork, when to begin eating, how to respond if someone offered a toast, and, most importantly, the sacred rule about speaking only when spoken to first. "I must emphasize," Lady Thornfield continued, "that this evening's dinner is particularly important for our kingdom's future prosperity. The agreements being celebrated tonight could bring significant economic benefits to our people. Any breach of protocol could be seen as disrespectful to our guests and potentially harm these crucial relationships." Catherine felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. The more important the event, the more pressure she felt to remain silent. She knew that her knowledge of economics and trade could contribute valuable insights to the discussions, but the risk of speaking out of turn seemed to grow larger with each passing formal event. "Lady Thornfield," Catherine said carefully, "what if someone presents information that I know to be incorrect? Or what if I have a solution to a problem they're discussing?" Lady Thornfield's expression grew stern. "Your Highness, you must trust that the adults in the room are capable of managing these discussions. Your role is to observe, learn, and represent the dignity of the crown. Speaking out of turn, even with good intentions, could be perceived as questioning the competence of our guests or our own advisors." Catherine nodded, but inside her frustration grew. How was she supposed to learn to be a leader if she was never allowed to participate in leadership discussions? How could she prepare to rule a kingdom if her voice was consistently silenced in matters of state? As the afternoon wore on, Catherine submitted to the lengthy preparation process required for formal dinners. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo. Her gown was carefully selected to represent the kingdom's colors without overshadowing the importance of the guests, and her jewelry was chosen to reflect her status while remaining appropriately modest for the occasion. Standing before her mirror, Catherine looked at her reflection and saw not a future queen, but a beautifully dressed ornament. The young woman staring back at her had intelligent eyes that held opinions and ideas, but those eyes would spend the evening carefully watching rather than engaging. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, Catherine made her way to the formal dining hall. The room was magnificent, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light across polished mahogany tables and fine china. Fresh flowers from the palace gardens created centerpieces that filled the room with a delicate fragrance. The guests were already beginning to arrive, and Catherine took her position in the receiving line next to her parents. She smiled graciously and offered appropriate greetings as each dignitary was introduced, but already she could feel the weight of the evening's silence settling upon her shoulders. Ambassador Richardson, a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and graying temples, approached her in the receiving line. "Your Highness," he said with a respectful bow, "it's wonderful to see you again. I hope you're well." "Thank you, Ambassador Richardson. It's always a pleasure to welcome you to our kingdom," Catherine replied, grateful for the opportunity to speak, even if only in response to his greeting. "I understand you've been studying international economics at the university level," he continued. "Such dedication to learning is admirable in someone of your position." Catherine felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this evening would be different. Perhaps Ambassador Richardson would engage her in conversation about the trade agreements, allowing her to contribute to the discussions in a meaningful way. "Thank you for your kind words, Ambassador. I find the subject fascinating, especially as it relates to building stronger relationships between our nations." But before the conversation could continue further, other guests approached, and Ambassador Richardson moved on to greet them. Catherine's moment of engagement had ended almost before it began, leaving her once again in the position of silent observer. As the guests filed into the dining hall and took their seats, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and resignation that accompanied these formal events. She would spend the next several hours listening to discussions she cared deeply about, surrounded by people whose respect she craved, yet unable to participate in any meaningful way unless someone specifically invited her to do so. The irony was not lost on her that in a few years, she would be expected to lead these very same discussions as queen, yet tonight she would sit in silence, her voice held captive by centuries of protocol and tradition. Little did Catherine know that this particular evening would test her resolve in ways she had never imagined, and that the sacred rule she had never been permitted to break would soon face its greatest challenge yet. The dinner began with the usual formalities. King Edward, Catherine's father, offered a welcoming toast to the distinguished guests, speaking eloquently about friendship between nations and the prosperity that would come from their new partnerships. Catherine raised her crystal glass along with everyone else, her smile perfectly practiced, her posture impeccable. As the first course was served, conversations began to flow around the table. Catherine found herself strategically positioned between Ambassador Richardson and Minister Crawford, just as Lady Thornfield had planned. To her left, Ambassador Richardson was deep in conversation with the delegate from the Northern Territories about shipping routes and port facilities. To her right, Minister Crawford was discussing currency exchange rates with his counterpart from the Eastern Kingdom. Catherine listened intently to both conversations, her mind automatically processing the information and identifying potential issues and solutions. When Ambassador Richardson mentioned concerns about winter shipping delays through the northern ports, she immediately thought of the alternative routes through the southern harbors that had been recently upgraded. When Minister Crawford discussed fluctuating currency values, she recalled her recent studies on economic stabilization methods that could benefit all the kingdoms involved. Yet she remained silent, her knowledge trapped behind the invisible barrier of protocol. Across the table, Prince Alexander was actively participating in a discussion about agricultural exports. At 19, he had the freedom to speak his mind, ask questions, and offer opinions without waiting for permission. Catherine watched as he engaged with the guests, his confidence growing with each exchange. She felt a complex mixture of pride in her brother's diplomatic skills and envy for his ability to express himself freely. "The harvest projections look very promising this year," Alexander was saying to the delegation from the Western Province. "Our agricultural minister believes we could increase grain exports by 20% over the next 2 years. The delegate nodded enthusiastically. "That would be excellent news for our trade partnership. We've been looking for reliable grain suppliers to support our growing population." Catherine knew that the 20% increase Alexander mentioned was optimistic without proper infrastructure improvements. She had spent weeks studying the transportation reports and knew that the current road systems and storage facilities would struggle to support such an increase without significant investment. But she couldn't speak unless someone asked her opinion directly, and no one was looking in her direction. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself growing increasingly frustrated. The conversations around her were touching on subjects she had studied extensively, yet she remained a silent observer to discussions that would shape the future of her own kingdom. During the third course, the conversation took a turn that made Catherine's heart race with both excitement and anxiety. Ambassador Richardson began discussing a complex trade dispute that had emerged between the Eastern Kingdom and a nation beyond their borders. The issue involved import taxes, shipping regulations, and diplomatic negotiations that had reached an impasse. "The situation has become quite delicate," Ambassador Richardson explained to the table. "We're dealing with a nation that has very different cultural approaches to business negotiations. Traditional diplomatic channels haven't been effective." Minister Crawford leaned forward with interest. "Have you considered alternative negotiation strategies? Sometimes approaching these situations from an economic rather than political angle can yield better results." "We've tried several approaches," the ambassador replied, "but we seem to be missing something fundamental about their cultural expectations." Catherine's pulse quickened. She had studied this exact situation in her international relations coursework. The nation in question valued personal relationships and long-term commitments over immediate economic gains. She knew of successful negotiation strategies that had worked in similar cultural contexts, approaches that focused on building trust and demonstrating commitment to mutual prosperity rather than focusing solely on immediate trade benefits. But no one had asked her opinion. The conversation was happening around her, about her, without her. Prince Alexander, noticing the complexity of the discussion, looked across the table at his sister. He had always admired Catherine's intelligence and knew she had been studying international relations extensively. "Catherine," he said, "didn't you write a paper on cross-cultural negotiation strategies? This sounds similar to some of the case studies you mentioned." Suddenly, all eyes turned to Catherine. Ambassador Richardson looked at her with genuine interest, waiting for her response. The moment she had been hoping for had arrived. Someone had directly addressed her, giving her permission to speak about a subject she was passionate about and knowledgeable in. But Lady Thornfield's words echoed in her mind. "Your voice carries the authority of the crown. Every word you speak in public represents not just yourself, but the entire kingdom." Catherine felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on her. This was her chance to contribute meaningfully to an important discussion, but it was also a moment where any misstep could reflect poorly on her judgment and, by extension, on the crown itself. "Yes," Catherine said carefully, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I did research several case studies involving negotiations with cultures that prioritize relationship building over immediate transactional benefits." Ambassador Richardson nodded encouragingly. "What did you discover in your research?" Catherine took a breath, organizing her thoughts. This was the moment she had been waiting for, but she needed to be perfect. The most successful negotiations in these contexts often begin with cultural exchanges rather than business discussions. When negotiators took time to understand and respect the other nation's traditions, values, and long-term goals, they were able to build the trust necessary for productive economic partnerships. "That's a fascinating perspective," Ambassador Richardson said thoughtfully. "Can you provide any specific examples?" Catherine felt a surge of confidence. "Certainly. There was a trade dispute between the Northern Alliance and the island nations 5 years ago. Traditional negotiations had failed for months until the alliance sent cultural ambassadors to live in the island nations for several weeks, learning their customs and demonstrating genuine respect for their way of life. Once that foundation of mutual understanding was established, the economic negotiations proceeded smoothly and resulted in a partnership that has been beneficial for both parties." The table had grown quiet, with all the guests listening intently to Catherine's explanation. She could see the interest in their eyes, the genuine consideration they were giving to her words. For the first time in her life, she was being heard not just as a princess offering polite conversation, but as a knowledgeable individual contributing valuable insights to an important discussion. Minister Crawford leaned forward. "Your Highness, that approach sounds promising, but how would you suggest implementing such a strategy in the current situation? The dispute has been ongoing for months, and time is becoming a critical factor." Catherine felt the exhilaration of being truly engaged in meaningful dialogue. Her studies had prepared her for exactly this type of question. The key would be to frame the cultural exchange as a gesture of respect and commitment to finding a lasting solution, rather than as another delay tactic. Perhaps sending a small delegation of scholars, artists, and cultural historians rather than political negotiators. This would demonstrate that the Eastern Kingdom values the relationship itself, not just the economic benefits it might bring. Ambassador Richardson was nodding thoughtfully. The current approach has been very focused on immediate economic gains. Perhaps that's been interpreted as short-sighted thinking by their cultural standards. "Exactly," Catherine said, her passion for the subject overriding her usual caution. In many cultures, the perception that someone is only interested in quick profits can actually damage trust and make negotiations more difficult. By demonstrating patience and genuine interest in understanding their perspective, the Eastern Kingdom could differentiate itself from other nations they may view as purely transactional in their approach. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced at a formal dinner. The guests began asking her detailed questions about cultural diplomacy, economic theory, and international relations. She found herself drawing on years of study, connecting concepts she had learned in books to real-world situations that were currently affecting the kingdoms represented around the table. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt like her voice truly mattered. Her insights were being valued, her opinions were being sought, and her knowledge was contributing to solutions that could benefit thousands of people across multiple kingdoms. Prince Alexander watched his sister with obvious pride and amazement. He had always known Catherine was intelligent, but he had never seen her in action like this. Her confidence grew with each question. Her insights became more detailed and nuanced, and her passion for the subjects was evident to everyone at the table. Minister Crawford turned to her with another question. "Your Highness, given your analysis of cultural diplomacy, how do you think we should approach the upcoming negotiations with the Mountain Kingdoms? They have very different economic structures from the nations we've been discussing." Catherine paused for a moment, considering the question carefully. The Mountain Kingdoms operated primarily on barter systems and community-based resource sharing, very different from the monetary economies of the other nations present. It was a complex situation that required careful consideration of multiple factors. "The Mountain Kingdoms present a unique opportunity," Catherine began, "because their economic system is based on mutual aid and resource sharing rather than profit maximization. This actually aligns well with the long-term partnership goals that would benefit all our kingdoms. Rather than trying to impose traditional monetary trade agreements, we could develop a system that honors their cultural values while still achieving the economic cooperation we're seeking." Ambassador Richardson looked intrigued. What would such a system look like in practice? Catherine leaned forward slightly, her enthusiasm evident. "We could create resource-sharing agreements that function on seasonal cycles, matching their agricultural and crafting traditions. For example, during their harvest season, they could provide agricultural products in exchange for manufactured goods during our productive periods. This would create interdependence without forcing them to abandon their cultural economic practices." The conversation continued for another hour, with Catherine contributing insights and answering questions with increasing confidence. She discussed economic theory, cultural anthropology, diplomatic history, and political strategy with a depth of knowledge that surprised and impressed everyone at the table. But as the evening wore on, Catherine began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. Lady Thornfield, seated at a nearby table, was watching with an expression that mixed pride with concern. Some of the older advisors were exchanging glances that suggested they were not entirely comfortable with a princess speaking so extensively and authoritatively in such a formal setting. Catherine realized that while she had been given permission to speak by Prince Alexander's initial question, she had far exceeded the boundaries of what was typically expected from her in these situations. She had not simply answered questions politely. She had taken on the role of an active participant, even sometimes steering the conversation toward topics she wanted to discuss. As the final course was being served, Catherine caught Lady Thornfield's eye across the room. Her governess's expression was difficult to read, but Catherine could sense that there would be a serious conversation in her future about the evening's events. Despite her growing awareness that she may have overstepped traditional boundaries, Catherine couldn't bring herself to regret the evening's conversations. For the first time in her life, she had experienced what it felt like to be valued for her mind rather than just her title. She had contributed meaningfully to discussions that could improve life for people across multiple kingdoms. She had felt, for a few precious hours, like the future queen she was supposed to become rather than the silent ornament she was expected to be. As the dinner concluded and guests began to offer their thanks and farewells, several of them made a point of approaching Catherine personally to thank her for her insights and express their hope for continued discussions in the future. Ambassador Richardson was the last to approach her. "Your Highness," he said quietly, "your contributions tonight were remarkable. I hope we'll have the opportunity to continue these discussions in future diplomatic meetings." Catherine smiled graciously, but inside, she wondered if there would be future opportunities. She had broken the unspoken boundaries of her role tonight, and she wasn't sure what the consequences would be. As the guests departed and the royal family retired for the evening, Catherine walked slowly back to her chambers, her mind replaying every moment of the evening's conversations. She had tasted freedom, intellectual engagement, and genuine respect for her abilities. Now, she would have to face the reality of what her unprecedented participation might mean for her future. Catherine barely slept that night. She lay in her ornate bed, staring at the ceiling while her mind replayed every moment of the dinner conversation. The excitement of finally being heard and valued for her intelligence warred with growing anxiety about how her unprecedented participation would be received by the palace hierarchy. She had broken new ground tonight, but she wasn't sure if she had shattered something precious in the process. The morning brought her answer in the form of an early summons to meet with her father, King Edward, in his private study. Catherine dressed carefully, choosing a modest blue gown that conveyed respect and humility. As she walked through the palace corridors, servants she passed seemed to avoid making eye contact, and she wondered if word of her evening's performance had already spread throughout the palace staff. King Edward's study was a warm, book-lined room where Catherine had spent countless hours as a child, listening to her father explain matters of state and governance. But this morning, the familiar space felt different. Her father sat behind his massive oak desk, his expression serious but not unkind. "Sit down, Catherine," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Catherine took her seat, folding her hands in her lap, and waiting for her father to speak. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications. "I received quite detailed reports about last evening's dinner," King Edward began. "It seems you made quite an impression on our guests." Catherine's heart sank. The way her father phrased his statement suggested that making an impression had not necessarily been a good thing. "I apologize if I overstepped, Father," Catherine said carefully. "Prince Alexander asked me a direct question, and I felt obligated to respond." King Edward raised his hand to stop her. "You misunderstand me, Catherine. I'm not here to reprimand you. I'm here because I need to understand what happened last night and what it means for your future role." Catherine looked up, surprised by her father's response. "I don't understand." King Edward leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter's face. Ambassador Richardson sent a message this morning requesting a private meeting with you to discuss your ideas for cultural diplomacy in more detail. Minister Crawford has asked if you might be willing to review some economic proposals he's preparing for next month's trade summit. 3 other guests from last night have made similar requests. Catherine felt her heart race with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. What did you tell them? I told them I would discuss it with you and provide an answer soon, King Edward said. But first, I need to understand what changed last night. Lady Thornfield tells me you've never spoken so extensively at a formal dinner before. Catherine took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation would shape not just her immediate future, but possibly the trajectory of her entire life. For years, I've sat in silence at these dinners, listening to discussions about subjects I've studied extensively, watching decisions being made that will affect our kingdom's future without being able to contribute anything meaningful. Last night, when Alexander gave me the opportunity to speak, I felt like I was finally able to use my education and my abilities to serve our kingdom in the way I was meant to. King Edward nodded slowly. And how did it feel to break the rule you followed so carefully for so many years? Catherine considered the question carefully. Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I was afraid I would say something wrong, that I would embarrass the crown or damage important relationships. But I was also energized in a way I've never experienced before. For the first time, I felt like I was being prepared to actually rule rather than just represent. King Edward was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he contemplated his daughter's words. Catherine, do you understand why that rule exists in the first place? Lady Thornfield explained that my voice carries the authority of the crown, and that every word I speak represents the entire kingdom, Catherine replied. That's part of it, King Edward said. But the deeper reason is that we live in a world where many people are not ready to accept a woman's voice as carrying the same authority as a man's. The rule was created, in part, to protect you from situations where your participation might be dismissed or, worse, might undermine your future authority as queen. Catherine felt a chill of understanding wash over her. You mean the rule was meant to preserve my credibility for when I actually become queen? Exactly. The theory was that by maintaining an air of dignified reserve during your preparation years, you would command more respect when you finally took the throne. King Edward paused, studying his daughter's expression. But last night, something different happened. Instead of your participation being dismissed or undermining your authority, it seems to have enhanced it. Catherine leaned forward slightly. The guests seemed genuinely interested in my opinions. They asked follow-up questions and requested private meetings to discuss ideas further. Yes, and that presents us with a dilemma, King Edward said. We have a choice to make. We can return to the traditional approach, honoring centuries of protocol and preparing you to rule in the conventional way. Or we can acknowledge that you've demonstrated an ability to command respect through your knowledge and insights rather than through silent dignity. The weight of this decision pressed down on Catherine's shoulders. She was being offered the chance to fundamentally change how she prepared for her future role as queen. But she also understood that this choice would have consequences far beyond her personal comfort. What would you advise, Father? Catherine asked. King Edward smiled for the first time since their conversation began. I would advise you to consider what kind of queen you want to be and what kind of kingdom you want to lead. The world is changing, Catherine. The challenges our kingdom will face in the coming years will require innovative thinking, diplomatic creativity, and the ability to build partnerships based on mutual respect and shared goals. Last night, you demonstrated all of these qualities. Catherine felt a spark of hope growing in her chest. Are you saying I could continue to participate in these discussions? I'm saying that perhaps it's time to prepare you for leadership in a new way, King Edward said. But I want you to understand what this choice means. If you continue down this path, there will be people who disapprove of your approach. Some will see your active participation as inappropriate for a princess. Others may view it as a sign that you're not properly trained in royal protocol. Catherine nodded, understanding the gravity of her father's words. But There will also be people who respect my ability to contribute meaningfully to important discussions. Exactly. And ultimately, the question becomes, which group of people do you want to lead? Those who value tradition above all else, or those who are ready to embrace a future where leadership is earned through competence and wisdom rather than just birthright and silence? Catherine thought about her years of education, the countless hours she had spent studying economics, international relations, and political theory. She thought about the frustration she had felt sitting in silence while important decisions were made around her. She thought about the excitement and fulfillment she had experienced the previous evening when her knowledge and insights were valued and sought after. I want to be a queen who leads through competence and wisdom, Catherine said firmly. I want to use my education and abilities to serve our kingdom and our people. I want to build the partnerships and solve the problems that will create prosperity and peace for future generations. King Edward stood up and walked around his desk to embrace his daughter. Then, we'll chart a new course together. But, Catherine, you must understand that this path will require courage, wisdom, and constant vigilance. Every word you speak will be scrutinized, every decision you make will be questioned, and every success you achieve will be attributed by some to luck rather than skill. Catherine hugged her father tightly. Understand, father, but I also believe that our kingdom deserves a queen who is fully prepared to meet the challenges of leadership, not one who has been trained to remain decoratively silent. Over the following days, news of Catherine's dinner performance spread throughout the palace and beyond. The reactions were as varied as King Edward had predicted. Lady Thornfield expressed deep concern about the precedent that had been set and requested a formal meeting to discuss appropriate boundaries for future public appearances. Several of the older court advisors whispered among themselves about the danger of allowing young royalty too much freedom in diplomatic settings. But there were also unexpected supporters. Queen Isabella, Catherine's mother, privately expressed pride in her daughter's demonstration of intelligence and leadership potential. Several younger members of the diplomatic corps sent messages of congratulation and support. Most surprisingly, Catherine received a letter from her great-aunt, Princess Margaret, who had been known for her own unconventional approach to royal duties during her younger years. My dear Catherine, the letter read, I was delighted to hear about your spirited participation in last week's dinner discussions. I hope you will continue to let your voice be heard, despite the undoubtedly mixed reactions you will receive. The kingdom needs leaders who can think critically and contribute meaningfully to important discussions. Your silence may preserve tradition, but your voice could preserve the kingdom. Catherine treasured this letter, keeping it in her private desk drawer as a reminder that her choice to break with tradition had historical precedent and support. The real test of her new approach came 2 weeks later, when Ambassador Richardson returned for his requested private meeting. Catherine prepared extensively, reviewing her research on cultural diplomacy and developing detailed proposals for addressing the trade dispute they had discussed at dinner. The meeting was scheduled to take place in the formal diplomatic receiving room, with Catherine's parents present as observers. This was uncharted territory for everyone involved. Never before had a princess of Catherine's age been invited to participate so directly in diplomatic discussions. Ambassador Richardson arrived precisely on time, and after formal greetings were exchanged, he turned to Catherine with genuine respect and anticipation. Your Highness, I've been eagerly awaiting the opportunity to discuss your cultural diplomacy ideas in more detail. The approach you outlined at dinner has the potential to resolve several ongoing diplomatic challenges. Catherine felt the familiar mixture of nervousness and excitement that had become her constant companion since the dinner. But this time, she also felt prepared and confident in her abilities. Thank you for your interest, Ambassador Richardson. I've developed some specific proposals that I believe could address the current impasse with the Eastern Kingdom's trading partners, Catherine said, gesturing to the document she had prepared. What followed was a detailed, hour-long discussion that covered economic theory, cultural anthropology, diplomatic history, and practical implementation strategies. Catherine presented her ideas clearly and confidently, answered challenging questions with well-researched responses, and offered creative solutions to complex problems. By the end of the meeting, Ambassador Richardson was visibly impressed. "Your Highness, these proposals are remarkably sophisticated and show a deep understanding of both the economic and cultural factors at play. I believe implementing these strategies could not only resolve the current dispute, but also establish a framework for more effective diplomatic relationships throughout the region." As the ambassador prepared to leave, he turned to King Edward. "Your Majesty, I hope you will consider allowing Princess Catherine to participate more actively in future diplomatic discussions. Her insights could be invaluable for strengthening relationships between our kingdoms." After Ambassador Richardson departed, Catherine's parents remained in the receiving room with her. The silence stretched for several moments as they all processed what had just occurred. "Catherine," Queen Isabella said finally, "that was remarkable. You conducted yourself with the wisdom and authority of someone far beyond your years." King Edward nodded in agreement. "You've proven that your voice deserves to be heard not because of your title, but because of your knowledge, your insights, and your ability to contribute meaningfully to important discussions." Catherine felt tears of relief and gratitude welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I promise I won't take it lightly." "I know you won't," King Edward said. "But, Catherine, remember that this is just the beginning. The path you've chosen will continue to present challenges and opportunities. Some people will always prefer the traditional approach, and you'll need to prove yourself over and over again." Catherine nodded, understanding that her father was preparing her for the realities of leadership in a world that wasn't always ready to accept change. "I'm ready for that challenge, Father. I believe in the importance of what we're doing." As Catherine walked back to her chambers that afternoon, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. The rules she had never been permitted to break had become the foundation of a new approach to her royal duties. Her voice, so long held captive by protocol, was finally being recognized as a valuable tool for serving her kingdom and her people. But she also understood that the real work was just beginning. Breaking the rule had been the easy part. Proving that she deserved the respect and authority her new role demanded would be a lifelong challenge that would test every aspect of her character, intelligence, and determination. 6 months had passed since the dinner that changed everything. Princess Catherine stood at the window of her private study, looking out over the kingdom she would one day rule. The landscape below bustled with activity, markets thriving, new construction projects underway, and trade caravans arriving with goods from neighboring kingdoms. Many of these positive developments could be traced back to the diplomatic successes that had followed her newfound voice in royal affairs. The cultural diplomacy strategies she had proposed to Ambassador Richardson had not only resolved the trade dispute with the Eastern Kingdom, but had also opened new opportunities for partnerships throughout the region. Her economic analysis had helped shape several successful trade agreements, and her insights into cross-cultural communication had become sought after by diplomats from multiple kingdoms. But the path had not been smooth. Catherine had faced criticism, skepticism, and outright hostility from those who believed she had overstepped her bounds. The learning curve had been steep, and there had been moments when she questioned whether breaking that fundamental rule had been worth the challenges that followed. A soft knock on her study door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," Catherine called, turning from the window. Sarah, her lady-in-waiting, stepped into the room with a concerned expression. "Your Highness, Lady Thornfield has requested an immediate meeting with you and your parents." She seemed quite urgent. Catherine felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Over the past months, Lady Thornfield had struggled to accept Catherine's expanded role in diplomatic affairs. Their relationship had become strained as Catherine's responsibilities grew beyond the traditional boundaries her governess had spent years establishing. "Did she say what this was about?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew. "No, Your Highness, but she was carrying several official-looking documents, and she mentioned something about serious concerns that must be addressed immediately." Catherine sighed. She had been expecting this confrontation for weeks. The success of her diplomatic involvement had led to increased responsibilities and higher visibility, both within the kingdom and internationally. Last week, she had been invited to address a gathering of regional economic ministers about sustainable development strategies. The speech had been well received and had generated significant positive attention for the kingdom, but it had also marked a complete departure from traditional royal protocol for an unwed princess. "Tell Lady Thornfield I'll meet with her and my parents in the formal sitting room in half an hour," Catherine said. "And, Sarah, please ask Prince Alexander if he could join us as well. I may need his support." As Sarah departed to deliver the messages, Catherine returned to her desk to review the speech she had given the previous week. She wanted to refresh her memory of exactly what she had said, anticipating that Lady Thornfield would have specific criticisms to address. The speech had focused on economic cooperation strategies that could benefit all the kingdoms in their region while promoting environmental sustainability and social development. Catherine had drawn on her studies of both classical economic theory and innovative approaches to international partnerships. The response from the attending ministers had been overwhelmingly positive, with several requesting follow-up meetings to explore implementation of her proposed strategies. But Catherine understood that from Lady Thornfield's perspective, the speech represented a fundamental violation of everything she had been taught about appropriate royal behavior. An unmarried princess addressing a formal gathering of government ministers from multiple kingdoms was unprecedented, regardless of how well-received the speech might have been. 30 minutes later, Catherine made her way to the formal sitting room where her family and Lady Thornfield were already assembled. The atmosphere in the room was tense, with Lady Thornfield sitting rigidly in her chair, several documents spread on the table before her. King Edward and Queen Isabella appeared calm, but serious, while Prince Alexander offered Catherine an encouraging smile as she entered. "Your Highness," Lady Thornfield began immediately, rising to offer a formal curtsy before launching into what was clearly a prepared speech. "I have requested this meeting to address serious concerns about the direction of Princess Catherine's public role and the potential consequences for the Crown's reputation and authority." Catherine took her seat, maintaining her composure despite the anxiety building in her chest. "I'm listening, Lady Thornfield." Lady Thornfield consulted her documents before continuing. Over the past 6 months, Princess Catherine has participated in diplomatic meetings, offered policy recommendations to foreign dignitaries, and last week delivered a formal speech to government ministers from 5 different kingdoms. While I acknowledge that these activities have received positive attention, they represent a complete departure from established protocol and create precedents that could have serious implications for the monarchy. King Edward leaned forward. "What specific implications concern you, Lady Thornfield?" "First," Lady Thornfield said, consulting her notes, "by speaking so authoritatively on matters of state before marriage and formal assumption of full royal duties, Princess Catherine risks being perceived as overstepping her current authority. Second, her high-profile involvement in policy discussions could create expectations that she will continue this level of public engagement even after marriage, which could complicate diplomatic relationships if her future spouse has different views on appropriate royal roles." Catherine felt her cheeks flush with frustration, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Lady Thornfield, with respect, my involvement in these discussions has been at the direct invitation of foreign diplomats and with the approval of my parents. The feedback we've received has been overwhelmingly positive." "The immediate feedback may be positive," Lady Thornfield replied, "but we must consider the long-term implications. There are already whispers among some court circles that Princess Catherine is being given responsibilities inappropriate for an unwed princess. Some foreign courts have expressed surprise at the level of authority she appears to wield in diplomatic matters. Queen Isabella spoke for the first time since Catherine had entered the room. Lady Thornfield, which foreign courts have expressed these concerns? Lady Thornfield hesitated slightly. I have received informal communications suggesting that some traditional allies are puzzled by Princess Catherine's prominence in recent diplomatic initiatives. Prince Alexander leaned forward. Informal communications from whom? If there are specific concerns, shouldn't they be addressed directly rather than through whispered rumors? Catherine could see that Lady Thornfield was struggling to provide concrete evidence for her concerns. She realized that her governess's objections were based more on traditional expectations than on actual diplomatic feedback. Lady Thornfield, Catherine said carefully, I understand your concerns about protocol and tradition, but can you point to any specific negative consequences that have resulted from my involvement in diplomatic affairs? Have any partnerships been damaged? Have any negotiations failed because of my participation? Lady Thornfield consulted her documents again, clearly searching for specific examples. Princess Catherine, the issue is not necessarily immediate negative consequences, but rather the precedent being set. If you continue on this path, future princesses will be expected to match your level of involvement, regardless of their interests or abilities. Catherine felt a spark of indignation. And would that be such a terrible thing? If future princesses are capable of contributing meaningfully to diplomatic and economic discussions, shouldn't they be encouraged to do so? That's not the point, Lady Thornfield said, her voice rising slightly. The point is that we have established protocols for good reasons. Royal authority is built on dignity, restraint, and carefully managed public presence. When royalty speaks too freely or too frequently, it can diminish the weight and importance of their words. King Edward had been listening to the exchange with growing thoughtfulness. Lady Thornfield, your concerns about maintaining royal dignity are valid and important. But I want to share some information that may influence your perspective. He stood and walked to a side table where several letters were arranged. Over the past month, I have received communications from 7 foreign monarchs and heads of state. All of them have specifically complimented Princess Catherine's diplomatic contributions and requested that she be included in future regional discussions. Catherine felt her heart leap with surprise and pride. Her father had not mentioned receiving these communications. King Edward continued. Additionally, 3 of our most important trading partners have credited Catherine's cultural diplomacy recommendations with resolving long-standing disputes that were threatening significant economic relationships. The Treasury Minister estimates that these resolved disputes will result in increased revenue equivalent to 15% of our annual budget. Lady Thornfield's expression showed her surprise at this information. I was not aware of the extent of these positive responses, Your Majesty. Furthermore, Queen Isabella added, Catherine has received invitations to participate in 2 upcoming international conferences on economic development and cultural exchange. These invitations specifically cite her expertise and insights as reasons for the requests. Prince Alexander smiled broadly. Sister, you didn't tell me about the conference invitations. Catherine shook her head. I only received them yesterday, and I wanted to discuss them with Mother and Father before mentioning them to anyone else. Lady Thornfield sat back in her chair, clearly processing this new information. I acknowledge that Princess Catherine has achieved notable successes in her diplomatic endeavors. However, I maintain that we must be cautious about the precedents being established. Catherine decided this was the moment to address the fundamental issue underlying their discussion. Lady Thornfield, I understand your concerns about protocol and tradition, but I need you to understand something about my perspective. For years, I followed the rule about speaking only when spoken of first. I sat in silence during countless dinners and meetings, listening to discussions about subjects I'd studied extensively, but unable to contribute anything meaningful. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The rule may have been designed to protect royal dignity, but in practice, it was preventing me from using my education and abilities to serve our kingdom. When I finally had the opportunity to contribute to meaningful discussions, I discovered that my voice could be a tool for strengthening diplomatic relationships and solving complex problems. Lady Thornfield listened intently as Catherine continued. I'm not advocating for abandoning all protocol or speaking carelessly in public settings, but I believe there's a difference between maintaining royal dignity and being artificially silenced. The feedback we've received suggests that respectful, knowledgeable participation in diplomatic discussions enhances rather than diminishes royal authority. King Edward nodded approvingly. Catherine raises an important point about the difference between dignified restraint and artificial limitation. The question we need to address is how to maintain appropriate protocol while allowing our heir to contribute her considerable talents to the kingdom's welfare. Lady Thornfield was quiet for several moments, clearly wrestling with the implications of everything she had heard. Finally, she spoke. Your Majesties, Princess Catherine, I must acknowledge that my concerns were based largely on traditional expectations rather than concrete evidence of problems. The positive feedback you've described suggests that Princess Catherine's approach is achieving beneficial results for the kingdom. Catherine felt a wave of relief wash over her. Lady Thornfield, I hope you'll understand that I never intended to disrespect your guidance or dismiss the importance of protocol. I simply believe we can honor royal dignity while also using our abilities to serve our people effectively. Lady Thornfield nodded slowly. Princess Catherine, I can see that your approach has been thoughtful and successful. Perhaps it's time for me to reconsider how we balance tradition with the evolving needs of leadership in our changing world. The conversation that followed was more collaborative than Catherine had dared hope. Together, they discussed ways to maintain appropriate protocol while allowing Catherine to continue her diplomatic involvement. Lady Thornfield even offered some valuable suggestions for how Catherine could further develop her skills and expand her contributions to international relations. As the meeting concluded, Lady Thornfield approached Catherine privately. Your Highness, I owe you an apology. I was so focused on preserving tradition that I lost sight of the ultimate purpose of that tradition, which is to prepare you to be an effective leader. Your successes over the past months demonstrate that you have found a way to honor royal dignity while also serving your kingdom with distinction. Catherine smiled warmly. Thank you, Lady Thornfield. Your guidance has been invaluable in helping me develop the judgment and discretion necessary for public service. I hope we can continue working together to find the best ways to balance tradition with innovation. That evening, Catherine sat in her private study, writing in her journal about the day's events. The confrontation she had been dreading for months had instead become an opportunity for understanding and collaboration. More importantly, it had provided official recognition and support for the path she had chosen when she first broke the rule that had defined her public behavior for so many years. As she wrote, Catherine reflected on how much her life had changed since that pivotal dinner 6 months earlier. Breaking the rule about speaking only when spoken to first had opened doors she hadn't even known existed. Her voice, so long held captive by protocol, had become one of her most effective tools for serving her kingdom and building bridges between nations. The challenges hadn't ended. Catherine knew that her approach would continue to face scrutiny and that she would need to prove herself again and again in new situations. But she also knew that she had found her authentic voice as a leader, one that honored royal dignity while embracing the full scope of her abilities and education. Looking toward the future, Catherine felt excited about the opportunities ahead. The upcoming international conferences would provide new platforms for contributing to regional cooperation and development. The diplomatic relationships she had helped build would continue to benefit her kingdom for years to come. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that tradition and innovation could coexist, creating new possibilities for effective leadership in a changing world. The rule she had never been permitted to break had become the foundation of a new understanding of what it meant to serve as a royal leader. Catherine's voice, finally free from artificial constraints, had proven to be exactly what her kingdom needed to face the challenges and opportunities of a new era. As she closed her journal that night, Catherine wrote one final reflection. Sometimes the most important rules to break are the ones that prevent us from becoming who we were meant to be. Today, I learned that courage and wisdom can transform even the most established traditions into stepping stones toward a better future. The princess who had once sat in enforced silence during formal dinners was now preparing to represent her kingdom on international stages. Her voice finally recognized as the powerful tool for service and leadership it was always meant to be. The rule had been broken, but in its place, something far more valuable had been built. A new model of royal leadership that honored the past while embracing the future with intelligence, dignity, and authentic purpose.